Welcome to the Step by Step podcast by Hidden Strength. We really hope you enjoy this episode.
And I mean, especially in your position, you've obviously had to go through a lot of different roles to get to the position that you are. Are there any people that you can point out directly as being a big influence in terms of what, like helping you get to where you got to, and in terms of in those people, what characteristics did they have that really helped you get to where you are?
Yeah, so I'd say the first half of my career, since joining the music industry, Laura Lucans, she was the woman who took a chance on me when she really didn't need to. And she gave me my first job in music, and really from day one wasn't afraid to put me in a position of authority. So I'll never forget, like, about a week after I joined, I was 20 years old, and she was like going on holiday, and she was like, yeah, you're the boss, I'm off, you're the boss. And it's quite rare, to find that, that quality in leadership. So she was amazing in terms of like helping boost my confidence and covering up for me when I made mistakes, do you know what I'm saying, and all of that type of stuff. And I always have to give her props. Georgia Gatudis, who was, I'd say the middle phase of my career, he was a really important figure, very sort of always giving me sage advice, do you know what I mean, and always kind of calm and calculated. And I learned to stay calm and calculated in sort of high pressure situations. Quite a lot of that I'll put down to him and watching how he operated. And then this current phase of my career that I'm in, big up Max Lusada, big up Tony Harlow. Two people that I've learned a lot from, a massive amount from, in the 4.5-5 years that I've been working alongside them. And yeah, I would say that, like, that sort of, when you're working, and you sort of deal with like visionaries and people that are, high achievers and people that have survived and thrived over decades, not 3 years, not 5 years, you're sort of talking 20 years, 30 years plus. It becomes easy, via osmosis to learn, from them, is what I'd say. But I'd also say that I'm inspired by people at all levels all the time, so there were some junior members of staff at Atlantic, for example, that are doing some amazing things, and I'll be like, oh, I like what that person's doing, and I'm inspired by little bits of success or little bits of things that they're doing, as well as people at my level and above as well. So it's a mixture. How I look for like mentorship and how I look for advice, it isn't linear. I'm not just looking upwards, do you know what I mean? It's kind of all the way around.
How do you feel radio stations starting out from when you joined till now? Same thing with like big brands that are taking over in like music studios. How do you feel how they have changed over the years and how they're influencing more younger people to try to get into music and potentially change their life?
So I think radio stations, the radio stations' place in the ecosystem has changed. So when I joined One Extra the year that YouTube launched. Do you know what I mean? Facebook was only a couple of years old. There was no Instagram. There was no Twitter. So when I joined One Extra, radio was really the only place where you could reach a mass market quickly. Mm-hmm. You had TV, but the way that TV worked, you might only see the video once or twice a day. But with radio, if something was on A-list rotation, you'd see it, you'd hear it 5, 10, 15 times a day, maybe sometimes. So, radio was really, the kingmaker, the queen maker, of the music industry. And, that's no longer the case, now. Streaming is the king and queen maker now. But radio still plays a really important part. If you want to be really famous, if you want to have a hit, you can have a hit just with streaming. But if you wanna be like super famous, do you know what I mean? You want to be like A-list famous, you need press and you need radio alongside streaming still. And listen, from my point of view is any company, platform, brand that's not just taking from the community but giving back can only be a good thing. So the fact that you've still got Capital Extra, One Extra, Kiss FM, Bauer Global, these big companies that are the conglomerates that own these radio stations, and obviously the BBC as well. It's wicked, man, that young people are still trying to get into radio. It's good that these companies are still spending hundreds of thousands of pounds, maybe even millions, on kind of youth culture, and long may it continue.
Yeah. What does it take for an artist to become a member or an artist for Warner Music?
So I just think it sounds cliche, but obviously make world-class music. Do you know what I mean? Like make good music, like, first of all. And then it's a combination. I would say that there's probably 100 different things that make somebody successful in music, from the quality of music to how you promote it, to the timing of when you release something, to where you're based, where you grew up, to the culture that you come from musically. There's literally so many different variables, and you need a collection of those variables all to come together at the same time to have a moment of success. Sometimes that can be someone walking past a busker when they're singing, and just the right person walking past, spotting that talent and helping them. Other times it could be like a TikTok dance, or something like that. There's multiple different ways and multiple different routes to success. But I would say that there probably are some common factors that I see between people that don't quite, get over the fence and those that do, and it's doing the basics well. It's, like I said, making world-class music. It's understanding your audience and understanding how to promote to your audience. It's taking feedback on board. Not all feedback is relevant for you, but the smart artists and the ones that seem to do really, really well in their careers, they take the feedback on board and they take the best bits of feedback from different, from different experts. But then, slightly contradictory, the best artists also have a really strong sense of self and are really, really clear about when we, whether it be we as the team or we as a label or whatever, should go a particular direction. So, yeah, man, there's lots of different variables, man. It's harder than ever to predict success in music, but I think we at Atlantic Records, man, I think we do a really good job of identifying talent, developing talent, and, helping it be as big as it can be.
Does the type of person behind the artist matter? So, like, their life, the struggles that they be going through, sometimes how the streets be taking one side from them, but they're trying to take one step out by leaning towards music, as you were saying, as they have to make good quality music. But for some people, they can't even afford to make music, let alone good quality music, or even know how to.
Yeah. That's a really good question. The studio that we're in is actually a studio that Warner's done a partnership with. And part of that partnership was around being able to offer our developing artists free studio time to help that exact conundrum. When you might have someone who's a developing artist and they come from the struggle, and yeah, £20 an hour studio time might be too much for them. So yeah, this studio, this complex is a really good example of how we're trying to take steps to redress that balance and address the issue head on with some practical, pragmatic steps to help the next generation of artists that are coming through. But yeah, it can be difficult, man, because the best art tends to come from an authentic place, and the best art across, painters, musicians, film, whatever, it tends to come from pain quite a lot of the time. Not all the time, but it tends to come from a level of pain and a level of trauma. And when you think to all of the classic all-time albums from, Marvin Gaye and Aretha Franklin and, Michael Jackson and, Adele and Drake and Ken, if you think about all of the classic albums, Ed Sheeran, etc., the stories behind them are often real stories of pain and trauma. So that can be quite tricky when you've got someone's real life pain and you're trying to overlay business on top of it. That can be quite a tricky balance to get right. And we don't always get it right as an industry. But generally, if the artist is comfortable sharing their pain and sharing their trauma, and we feel like it's not putting them at risk, sharing that trauma and sharing that pain, then, it's art at the end of the day, and we're going to be here to magnify it. You know, there are some things where, you know, me as a label executive, you know, sometimes you have to tell a true story, and that can sometimes mean offending other people. But yeah, me personally, I think if something goes maybe a little bit over the line in terms of it's a true story, you know, you're mentioning real people, etc., then, you know, I try to shy away from that, because, you know, that wouldn't be healthy, supporting that.
Yeah.
I guess you talked about how like the industry has shifted in a good way in terms of being more accepting of people. Do you think there's still more to go? And if so, what steps do you think need to be taken in order to get to a more accepting industry in the next 10 years, let's say?
I think the music industry, out of all the kind of, let's say, major British industries, feels like one of the more accepting industries. I sort of engage or interact with other industries, or, you know, you've got friends that work in other industries or whatever. And if I think about, you know, race, if I think about sexuality, if I think about kind of in the UK, the stupid class system that we have, do you know what I mean? All of those things. I think the music industry is generally more accepting than other industries. But there can always be more, you know, more can always be done, you know, more can always be done. But it tends to come from the top down. So the more people that you have in genuine positions of influence, not just kind of vanity roles, but genuine positions of them being able to influence things sort of business wide, that's when you then get change, you know. So that means more people from different sexualities at the top of the food chain. That means more people from different housing, social backgrounds at the top of the food chain. That means people from different ethnic backgrounds, you know, at the top of the food chain. And diversity, of course, you know, as a young, not so young anymore, but as a black man, you know, the diversity around race is massively important to me. And anyone who knows me knows how serious I take it. Alongside that, I want to make sure that there's diversity in other areas too, alongside the diversity, you know, around race. And listen, man, like I said, there's always more that can be done, you know, for sure. At Atlantic, and Warner Music as a whole in the UK business, man, I'd say that we've tried really hard to redress the balance. But when you've got decades and decades of the sort of system being built a particular way, it can take years and years and years to unpick it and untangle it, because it literally is like a mad, complicated shoelace, do you know what I'm saying? So I feel like we've unpicked a few layers, do you know what I mean? But there's still a few layers to go. But big up Tony Harlow, do you know what I mean, for definitely trying to affect some real positive change in all of those areas.
No, and I think race we talked about earlier when I was doing interviews, and it's a massive player in like so many different lives. And as a white guy, I don't luckily have to deal with any of that. And it's so interesting to hear different perspectives from different people who have had to live through those lives, and just understanding that while we're in the same world, different experiences are happening, and it's completely shifted the perspective that you can have on certain areas. And are there any situations or stories that you're happy to say for the people listening in terms of how you were able to deal with racism or anything in the industry or even before that?
I mean, no one's ever tried that shit with me, man. Do you know what I mean? So I've been quite lucky, and that could have just been luck, or it could have been because I didn't put myself in a position where people felt that they could, you know, be like that in the industry. With me particularly, I know that hasn't always. That's not everyone is as lucky as me, you know, in that regard. And I have heard some kind of horror stories over the years, but that's their story to tell, not mine. But for me, I've always been like really clear that like that's not something I'm gonna accept in any way, shape or form. That's in the workplace and in my career. Of course, in my personal life is a different story, and that's like an everyday thing, you know, especially growing up in the kind of 90s and early noughties. And that's, you know, I mean, even now, you know, you can walk into a shop, you know, and the security guard might just look at you a slightly particular way, you know, a slightly different way, and you're sat there like, raw, like, you know, I can. You know, I don't mean this in a crude way, but I can buy anything in this shop. Do you know what I'm saying? And but I'm being looked at, you know, like a potential thief, you know, or you might be sort of behind someone on the escalator on the tube or whatever, and they might clutch their bag that little bit tighter or whatever. That's like real life stuff that still happens to the average black guy every single day.
And mentorship in general is really important. And you talked about, for example, how you've now got kids. Did your perspective change when you had kids in terms of becoming a dad and how that affected your role, or do you think that there was no sort of change in that aspect?
I think when you have kids, you just realise that it's not that deep. You know, nothing's that deep. So you know, there are a few jobs in this world where it is that deep. Like if you're an airline pilot, it's deep. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
If you're a trauma surgeon, then it's deep. Do you know what I mean? But sometimes it can feel, when things are going wrong, especially, it can feel like the world's ending. And then you just have to zoom all the way out, you know, and you realise like this really isn't anything that we need to, you know what I mean, think the world's ending over is what I'd say. So definitely kids help with that. But you know, having a pet might help with that. Do you know what I mean? Some people have got that gene in them naturally where they're able to zoom out. You know, for others like myself, it took having kids to, you know, be like, oh shit, right, that thing over there is not. It's like so tiny compared to like this little crying thing, you know, that's in front of me.
Yeah, and I think that it's really important to have that perspective, obviously, and I think like going forward and trying to understand like the world in general. We talked earlier about finding yourself and being true to yourself in an industry like the music industry, where there's a lot of personalities and there's a lot of people that maybe you could take like pieces of and try and blend in. How do you manage to stay true to yourself and true to who you are?
It can be tricky because you can be yourself, but you can also still be a social chameleon, you know, code switch, I think they call it now. And that's not you being not true to yourself. It's just some people naturally code switch and some people, you know, don't. So I feel like, you know, I've always been lucky in that I've had the confidence to be my authentic self, but my authentic self is many different faces. Like Arsenal supporting Sports Austin is very different to, do you know what I mean, caring, mentoring Austin, which is very different to when I'm around my friends that I grew up with at school, Austin, you know, where it's like, you know, the WhatsApp group chats or whatever. Like, so I think naturally people have got a few different faces. Like I'm sure your parents might not see certain parts of your personalities and conversations that you're having, right? So I would just say that like the corporate world is far more accepting of people being their natural selves now than in years gone by. You can walk into a corporate office, you can work for a bank now and walk in a hoodie. Not all banks, but some banks, do you know what I mean? You can work for the most stiffest kind of sounding company and come in your Tommy Jeans jacket, do you know what I'm saying, or your Rich's hoodie. Like, and that wasn't always the case, you know. And I'm when I'm like traveling to work or whatever, and I'm like driving through the city, and I'll see like, you know, kids that clearly are expressing themselves. They might have an earring in or a piercing in. They might have their hair in a particular way. They might be wearing trainers, you know, whatever. And it makes me happy, man, because I'm like, yeah, that's sick. Like, it's amazing that, like, people can be their authentic selves. And I would say big up the tech industry, because it feels like the tech industry were the ones that led that approach of, like, you know what? Fuck the suits, you know, fuck the smart dress. We're just going to come in shorts and, you know what I mean, a Hawaii shirt or whatever. And I'm glad that energy is transmitted. And even the way that we're all dressed here today, the people behind the camera, the sound engineer, do you know what I mean, we're all dressed our kind of authentic self. But sometimes my authentic self is a 3-piece suit and some nice shoes. So yeah.
Well, we were getting along so well, and then you mentioned you're an Arsenal fan, and having lived with 3 Arsenal fans, it's slightly disappointing. But
for my sins.
Well, Chelsea fan, just so you're aware. So
what do you encourage your artists who go through similar things on a daily basis when they're performing? How do you teach them to handle a situation with care, because it could potentially end their career in a sense?
You know what? I would say artists that come from certain genres actually, unfortunately, are far more experienced than I am when it comes to dealing with this, because, you know, if you look at the Metropolitan Police, for example, historically they had their Form 696 form, which was a form that if you were wanted to put on a night in a London nightclub or bar or venue, you would have to fill in this form, and you'd have to put the genre of music that you were playing on that night, and if it was like hip hop, R&B, drill music, etc., then the police would ask for you to put certain safeguards in place. And if you didn't, and something went wrong, then you could potentially have your license taken away. And it was seen by many as almost like a racist form, or a form that made it unfair if you were making particular genres of music. And probably all of the, especially rap and hip hop and drill artists that we've worked with over the years have kind of. I don't want to say they've fallen foul of it, because I don't know if all of them have, but they all have stories, do you know what I mean, of there being situations where their live events have been disrupted by over-policing, is what I would say. So I think the 696 form has been kind of abolished. I feel like it might have been replaced by something, but I haven't got my facts straight on that, so I don't want to say something that's not correct. But the police have got a long history of antagonizing, and treating unfairly black musical genres. Ultimately, what I would say is I just want to make sure that every genre is treated fairly, and that everyone gets an opportunity to perform live. And it's always a shame when we have an artist that it doesn't really happen, and it hasn't really happened for a while now. So I don't want to make it out like it's a current immediate problem. It's less of a problem now, I would say, than it was 5-10 years ago. But we still do hear the odd horror story. And it's our job, again, as a label, to back them, and we have in the past backed our artists when there has been situations where, their events have been disrupted.
Yeah. Do you remember the wave of when they were trying to ban drill because it was inciting violence and crime in a lot of people's neighbourhoods, in a lot of London, all over? As a major label, how did you personally feel about that, especially being a VP of Atlanta Records, as well as what was you doing to protect your artists who was going through the same thing, who almost felt like their career was ending?
During that period, we had one artist, that's Tion Wayne.
Okay.
We had one artist, and obviously, he did, he had a lot of drill records that done really, really well. I would say that like we never had any issue with him in particular, because he is genius enough to know the line, sort of lyrically in terms of like crossing it or whatever. I'm kind of big up Tion and the whole team, because the relationship between Tion and Atlantic Records was very successful. And, we wish him all the best in his independent career. But I would just say that like, it's this constant battle of and conversation of art versus reality. And does life imitate art, or does art imitate reality? Or does art imitate life, sorry. And, people have to tell their story, and people have to hold up a mirror to society. And sometimes what they're reflecting back on the listener isn't pretty. And if we're going to allow someone to tell their trauma, and that trauma is around their heart being broken, if we're going to allow people to tell their trauma, and that trauma is them being abused, we have to let people tell their trauma, and that trauma might be violent, I don't believe in supporting any artist who talks about a real life situation, and like, for example, that person is deceased and that person is, sort of talking ill about them, etc. That's never going to be something that I support. At Spotify, we didn't playlist that when I was running it. We didn't playlist any song that was like a diss track, to kind of another person. And at Atlantic Records, we wouldn't sign an artist or a record that was like a diss track, again, across all genres. Now, of course, hip hop is a competitive genre. So there's always going to be jabs and, little lines here and there, and that's different. That's just competitive sport. That's just the nature of the genre. But once something crosses the line, then of course we have to have a conversation about it. But we've never had to do that, is what I'd say.
No, thank you very much, Austin, for joining us. Finally, in terms of what we've been asking our guests, is if you have one concrete piece of advice or one takeaway that you want people to have from today, what would that be?
What would that be? I would say the concrete advice would be listen to this interview 3 or 4 times. So you can pick out the gems, because I've thrown a lot of things at you guys that have been listening, and you're not going to get it all in one go. Just listen to it. Put it in your speakers, put it in your car, put it in your AirPods, listen to it a few times. That's what I'd say.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Cool, man. Nice one, guys, man. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you so much for watching today.
If you feel like you need additional support after the podcast, we've linked resources below.
Please like, share, subscribe, whatever you're listening to us on today.
And download our Hidden Strength app.